So, following up on what we heard in the first hour, it can be hard to sort out how we feel and even harder to figure out what we might do about the existential threat of nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race. Because the idea of mass destruction, this idea that everything could be lost, that the experience of the young boy in that video, coupled with our own, I think, a fear of being helpless. What can we do against the huge machinery and the vast amounts of money that propel the nuclear arms race forward can be sort of paralyzing. Most people, most of the time, don't think about it. When I was in Germany this summer, on Tuesday morning, a group of us did what we call a go-in, which is a trespass on the air base. So we did several kinds of actions during the International Peace Camp. There are vigils on the roundabout right outside the main gate, and then there are blockades where we spread out with our banners across the gate and shut it down when the workers are coming in. But then they also do go-ins. So on Tuesday morning, we did a go-in with a couple of banners that said nuclear weapons are illegal in German and in English. And we went in, and of course they stopped us after we got through the gate and before we made it to the second main security barrier. And they held us there in the road for 25, 30 minutes maybe, while they were slowly figuring out what the police were going to do and then processing us and getting our information and stuff like that. And finally, I started chatting with the guard who was sort of assigned to me, young policeman, and turned out that he spoke English pretty well. He had a cousin who lived in New Jersey, and he'd been over and spent a summer there when he was a junior in high school, so we chatted about that. And I said, do you ever think about the nuclear bombs that are here? That the fact that this air base here where you live makes this a prime target for a launch? I said, because when I'm here, these jets take off every morning at 9 o'clock in the morning, which is 3 o'clock in the morning, Washington, D.C. time. In the first summer I was there, they do these practice runs, and as I was trying to catch one on the videotape, I thought, I hope that's a practice run. Because it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and Donald Trump's been known to tweet at 3 o'clock. But then I realized that if it were not a practice run, we would never know. 10 minutes after they left, we would be gone, because their launch would precipitate a similar kind of a launch of missiles from Russia. And Bushel would be at the top of the list of places to take out. So I asked this, I told the guy I thought about that, and he said, he did this. He said, we try not to think about it. We try not to think about it. Later in the afternoon, so we finished getting arrested, and they gave us what those of you who are familiar with actions at SOA in this country we got a ban and bar letter for 24 hours. 3 pages. They gave it to me, and they had one of their better English speakers say, so you are not allowed within 500 meters of this main gate of the air base for 24 hours. And they paused and said, well, except for your camp, which was about 100 meters away. You can be at your camp. And the roundabout, which was about as close as from me to here to Marcus. You can be in those places, otherwise why would I even be there if I couldn't protest and demonstrate? So we got back to the camp and we talked about that. And one of the goals in the initial actions there, German citizens are treated by the legal system much differently than U.S. citizens, because we just walked away. But Gerd Bunzli, one of our German friends, was eventually put on trial and found guilty and fined about 2,500 euros or 70 days in jail, of which he served 10, and then he bought his way out of the others. So basically there's a price per day for jail, and you can either pay the fine or you can go to jail. And I thought Gerd was brilliant, because he used that as an opportunity to go to groups and say, would you take a day of my jail time But they said, for what? And then he would explain nuclear weapons at Bushel. It was a great organizing tool to do that. Plus, he spent 10 days in jail, so he came out as a hardened criminal. Adds a little bit extra to the story. But we wanted to test. So first step was get a ban letter, which we got, and the second step was to test it. So that afternoon, we did a go-in. Our friend Hops circled the base and found a place where he thought we could get out of our cars unseen and make it over to the fence, but then we would be visible to the highway. So we did that. 4 of us were in the group that cut fences and went in, put banners on the fence, and went farther up. And eventually, and the other 4 were spray painting crime scene with spray chalk. Spray chalk is a really cool thing if you're an activist, because it's as good as paint, except it's not paint. So they were spraying things on the bike path, which runs all around this military base. And eventually they caught us, and there we were inside the base now, sitting on a dirt road, waiting for the police to get there. The police had to figure out how to get in, so they had to find where we cut the fence so they could come in our hole. And the guards who were there with me at that time, it was another 45 minutes or so waiting, and they didn't speak German, or at least they weren't the guy who, didn't speak English. They weren't the guy who came and brought us nice bottles of cold water and chatted with us initially. But I noticed as I was talking with my colleagues that one of them was chuckling every time we said something funny, which was, those of you who know me may find it hard to believe, but we said funny things. And so I tried to strike up a conversation with him. And I said, this morning when I talked to Alex, he told me that he rarely thinks about the nuclear weapons that are here. And I'm just wondering, do you ever think about the nuclear weapons here? Or what do you think about the fact that there are bombs here at Bushel? Your family is at risk, it makes it a target. And he said, I don't think about nuclear weapons, never until today. So it made me realize that part of what we were doing was even trying to raise awareness, and it's a very small community. It is right next to the air base, and people are oblivious to the fact of the nuclear weapons there. So it's called psychic numbing, when you suppress something that's just too difficult to deal with. And it might be a helpful mechanism once in a while with something that is troubling us. I had an aunt who used to defer all of her worrying about dental appointments. She would put the appointment on the calendar, and 2 hours before she would mark out a time to worry about it. And up until that time, she suppressed. Any time it popped into her head, she thought, oh no, that's Tuesday at 2, I'm worrying about that because my appointment's at 4, right? So sometimes it's okay to push things aside, keep them out of your head. But an urgent existential threat of nuclear weapons, we suppress that at our peril. So it occurs to me that one of the ways that we can gather our thoughts and try to deal with them is to make ourselves put them into words. So I have prepared a little exercise in communication, which I have very cleverly titled, Can We Talk? One of the hurdles that we have to overcome is the difficult subject, because in terms of dinner table conversation, like at Thanksgiving dinner, I'd put that right up there with, so how about that Trump, huh? Yeah. So let me go back here to do the slides. Just a couple. Can we talk about the catastrophic destruction of the planet and the extinction of life as we know it? Wouldn't that be a good conversation starter at Thanksgiving? Right. It's important, though, that we do talk at some point about an existential threat. Earlier this week, I was on a conference call with people who work for a group called Rethink Media in Washington, D.C., and their job basically is to talk about messaging, and they focus a lot on nuclear weapons. So Jay Coughlin from the Los Alamos group and I had a conversation in which I said, after the Russia accident, the media actually has used the word arms race, new arms race, as they try to describe why these things are happening in Russia. And And that's the kind of language, unlike modernization, arms race is language that sort of gets people's attention. So we called the Rethink Media people and said, have you done any work on testing out messaging, how to frame this, or if it's being framed? No, they said, not yet, but we're fascinated. Can we talk? So we had this conversation with them. And near the end of it, she described a webinar that they had just had in which they engaged people in messaging about nuclear weapons issues today. And I said to her, I think that's brilliant because I just spent 2 hours planning to do that exact same thing this weekend in Gatlinburg with the Catholic Committee on Appalachia. And anytime somebody agrees with me, I think they're brilliant. And then she said, hey, I'll send you the link to our webinar. That cut my prep time considerably. So, here's what they told me about the way that we communicate most effectively with people when talking about issues that may be controversial or that maybe they haven't thought about very much. First, they said, for effective communication, you have to be comfortable with your material. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to be an expert. But it's helpful for you to know a little something about what you're talking about. And the second piece of it is think about stories, because people don't usually like to be talked at. They like to be talked with. And that resonated with me. Back when I was in the pastorate, I spent a lot of time studying about how to do effective preaching. And at that time, there was a professor named Fred Craddock at Emory University in Georgia. And he wrote a book called Overhearing the Gospel. And he described how Soren Kierkegaard told a story of walking down a sidewalk in Europe. And along the side of the field that he was walking past was a tall fence. And as he walked along, he heard some voices, and he stopped and he eavesdropped. He listened to a conversation on the other side of the fence, and he realized it was a cemetery. And the conversation was between an old man and a young child, and they were talking about the generation, the old man's son, the little child's father, who was in the ground. And he heard this conversation, and he came away deeply moved, and he realized that there is something about overhearing that makes communication easier than direct face-to-face talking. So that if you happen to hear me talking to Kevin Collins about nuclear weapons, and you hear something that makes you stop and listen, you don't have to be defensive. I'm not talking to you. You don't have to marshal other arguments. You can just freely listen and let these ideas come into your head. And when things are difficult, that might be an easier way to communicate. So another way we do that is to tell people stories about things that happen, so that you get a piece of the experience that I had, even though you didn't read Fred Craddock's book about overhearing the gospel. But you're able to consume some of that information. So here are 3 key things that they said about effective communication. People respond well when they are given choices, rather than when they are given the whole world of ideas to think about. So you may have had this experience when you're have met up with somebody and you're thinking of going out to eat. Where do you want to eat? Oh, I don't care. I mean, wherever, right? But if you say, would you rather eat at Olive Garden or Sitar? Oh, I think I feel like Sitar. That'd be great, right? But a clear choice makes it easy for people to process and come down somewhere. So think about framing messages in terms of choices. Would you rather have your money spent on a nuclear bomb plant, or would you rather have it spent on education? All right? It's easier to get people to think about that than if I just went and said, how do you feel about $6.5 billion tax dollars being spent on this? Second point was know your audience. Part of this is just about even what kind of language that you use. So I'm at a meeting with the Catholic Committee on Appalachia. I imagine most of the people in the room are fairly progressive, probably even activists at some point in their lives. They have a faith base out of which they operate, or they are comfortable with it, even if it's not a faith that they embrace themselves. And they know what the topic was, so they probably at least are passing interested in this. So I can use certain language with you. I can talk about the Pope, and probably everybody in the room knows who the Pope is. But I go to talk some places where people say, Pope, don't know. I know Big Papi was first baseman for the Boston Red Sox, right? Actually, if they know the Boston Red Sox, they probably know about the Pope. But to know your audience and to understand your audience, what are their values? What are the things that they agree with? What are the tune-outs for them? What would make them drop out of the conversation? What might make them more responsive? What might they remember? Right? So I didn't realize till I had kids. I remember the first week or so that my daughter was in preschool, and somebody told me some story of something that happened. They had an interaction with my daughter and helped her, and I thought, oh, I love you. And everybody who treats my daughter nice is going to be a friend of mine for the rest of my life. This changed everything. It was like you weren't just a stranger or another parent in the preschool. You were somebody who cared for my daughter, right? So understanding what will people remember, how do you make a connection with them, is an important thing for how to be effective communicating with your audience. And the third thing they said was use rhetorical tools. So what was the rhetorical tool Jesus used most frequently when he talked with his audiences? Anybody? Parables, of course. And not just any parable, not just a fantasy story, but for the most part, he used parables that talked about nature, common experiences that everybody had. It didn't matter what part of society you were from, you understood about the sun rising. Martin Luther King Jr. effectively used these rhetorical tools. If you ever sat down with some of his sermons, he didn't start out with, I have a dream. He would often start out with, the philosopher Plato once said, and the first 10 minutes of his sermon was an intellectual, philosophical discussion right out of Boston College or the seminary that he came from, no matter where he was talking, no matter who he was talking to. But as he went into it, the language changes to the sweltering heat of oppression. Doesn't matter where you are, if you're a college professor or if you're a sharecropper farmer in Alabama, you know about sweltering heat. So the rhetorical tools that he went to when he was getting down to his subject matter, when he was making the transition, were things that everybody could relate to. So aphorisms, quotations, visualizations, metaphors from nature or our experience. Think about the tools that you have to work with for your audience. So what I want to do with you in the next 45 minutes or so is let you help me figure out about rhetorical messaging for the information that you have so far been exposed to today. So to do this, I think we're matched up pretty well, except these two lonely people here need to move into another circle. And I don't care where you go if there's an empty seat. And if you're on the periphery and you want to participate in this, you should come and find a circle that can use a chair, or even pull your chair up. So I think we set up like circles of 6. I don't care if there's 7 or 8 in a circle, that's fine. Now in each circle, somebody has a folder under a chair that they're sitting on with a pencil on top of it. So you're that So does every circle have a folder? Any circle doesn't have one? Okay. So the fact that you had a folder under your chair means you could be the facilitator for your circle. It's not a hard job, but if you don't want to, you should assign that task to someone else. And the other task for your circle, because inside that folder, on the left-hand side, there are some blank pieces of paper. That's for your note taker to capture the conversation when you get to that point, and that's what the pencil's for. And the note taker might report back to us at the end of our time on what you all talked about. So what's in your folder? On the right-hand side are pieces of information. I'll get to that in just a second. And what's on the front of your folder are three important pieces of information. One is your audience, where you're going to, where this message that you're going to craft is going to be delivered. And the second thing is the subject. So imagine that you have been called by a person to arrange a speaking engagement, say at the AARP luncheon, and they want to put a brief synopsis of your talk into their, maybe just a sound bite or two, into their program booklet. This is what it's going to be about. And they say to you, oh, and I think people would really like to hear about the economics of nuclear weapons, or the religious and moral implications of the new global nuclear arms race. So the subject line here tells you what your audience has asked you to talk about. And then the third thing that's on the front is a list of the resources that you have. So leader, if you'll open up your folder, you see on the right-hand side some pieces of information, and I think probably there will be one for everybody in your circle. And you can distribute those. Here's my suggestion. There's a lot of information, so everybody, for instance, might take one of these, whatever color your sheet is, but you might divide up the responsibilities. So, for instance, somebody in your group, or two people might read the article, two other people might read this article, two other people might look at this piece of information. Some of you have two things, some of you have three, some of you may have four, but divide up the responsibilities. Take a few minutes to read, and then when you come back, you will talk about messaging. Based on what you have learned, a conversation in your group for 15 to 20 minutes, what will be the most effective things that we can message to this audience about the new global nuclear arms race? Questions about that process? Yes.
Our folder shows 3 resources, but there's only 2 in here.
Is there something on the back of one of them, maybe?
Oh, yes, good.
Okay, good.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad there was. 'Cause that was process question. Yeah. Yeah, so basically, I want you to craft the soundbite, or the heart of the message. So, how, given this audience, given this particular lens they've asked you to look through, what do you think are the things that would be the most effective messages to deliver to them? So it might be a soundbite, it might be the, a very sketchy outline of what you would say, 2 or 3 key points that you're going to try to make.
So the front of the folder says
All right, time. So for report backs, I'm going to ask for one person from each group, one at a time, to come up here so that Michael can record this easily from there. And when you come up, if you're the designated person, if you would tell everyone else who your audience was and what your subject matter was, and then just the kind of messaging that arose in your group that you thought might be effective in terms of communication. So, who wants to go first and set the model for us?
Right here.
We'll start over here. Maybe we'll just snake our way around the room.
Okay, I immediately put my hand up because I don't want to do this. So I thought I'd just get over it, and Marcus would not do it. Because he said it costs too much. So our audience was John the 23rd's campus ministry. Our subject was faith communities addressing nuclear weapons. And then we had very long things to read.
Say the topic again.
So, we,
Safe communities? What was it?
say that again, okay, our audience was John the 23rd campus. Got it? And then the subject was faith communities address nuclear weapons. And we decided that what we would, approach we would take was to start out with finding out what do these young people know. So getting out of them the information about what they know about nuclear weapons, consequences of nuclear weapons, etc. And we thought that connected that to bullying, because they would all know about bullying and the consequences of bullying, and how then they could connect that with what do they know, like they know about bullying, what do they know about nuclear weapons? They know about the consequences of bullying. What do they know about the consequences of nuclear weapons? And then also that bullying, a lot of times you turn into a bully in other ways or with other people. Well, what are the consequences of that with nuclear weapons? So again, it's just trying to get out of them what they know and connecting to what they know. And then asking them, can these consequences of nuclear weapons, after we've had that discussion, can they be ignored? Justify it. Yes, you can, or no, you can't. Can you remain silent about that? Do you act on that? So again, it's just trying to get at what you were saying about their choices. And what are the consequences? And affirming them in their responses, but then moving to that more faith perspective of all religions. And we had a brochure that listed all religions teach about nuclear weapons and basically the evil of nuclear weapons and the consequences of them. And that as a faith community, we believe in life, we believe in love, and the consequences of nuclear weapons are an antithesis to that. So then we thought that maybe what we could do is conclude with, what do you want your life to be? What do you want to be remembered for? And does that fit with your answer to, can we ignore the consequences? Can we remain silent? Team, do you want to say anything? Did I miss something? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, well done. Sure, we'll just snake around like this.
Okay, our group had the audience of an interfaith council luncheon, and the subject was faith communities address nuclear weapons. So that was a pretty easy group of like-minded people, generally. We decided to use the image, the story of Dorian, the recent hurricane, and asking people to imagine and picture what they've seen on the news recently in the last week, and especially in the Bahamas, just the total destruction, and trying to imagine what that would be like when you're home, if you return there or if you stayed there and it looked unrecognizable, totally flattened, and that fear of where your family members were, your neighbors, your community, your friends, your pets. And with that image, try to imagine too then that destruction of a nuclear disaster. The weather issue was certainly out of our control, but a nuclear disaster would be the result of deliberate actions of men and women. So history has drawn us to this moment now, and as our faith community, interfaith community, we must speak with the clearest prophetic voice. And we felt too that our faith communities, as always, things really change from the grassroots. And so we had this statement to work from that was wonderful, this interfaith statement that where many churches contributed, the Roman Catholic Church, the Jewish Peace Fellowship, the Episcopal Church, Unitarian, Lutheran, Muslim, Americans, Presbyterian. And so we worked a lot from this document as our platform, but then to say that we will educate ourselves and work within our faith communities to make a difference on this issue. Anything else? Okay.
Is it you, Carrie?
Yeah.
Our topic was we're presenting. Wait, what's the wrong one there? We're presenting to a group of progressive students. So therefore, we figured it's a progressive sort of university. And we therefore selected Berea, since Berea is local and in Appalachia. The subject is your money and your bomb. And then we were given certain resources. First thing we did was to think about, to the students, what is their money? The $2 in their pocket? Or the money they earned down at Hardee's? Or then a member of our group said, you know, these students have their tuition is paid. They have funds from the university level that are provided for them. Their money is as much that pool of money, the university money that is invested in certain ways. So really, then transitioning to, do you all feel you have an obligation to look over the shoulders of the leaders of Berea about how they spend that money? Are they spending it in mutual funds that include nuclear weapons? Do you know? And do you feel you have an obligation of any sort to look at that, or you let somebody else take care of that? So trying to wake them up to a sense of ownership of that big pool of money, as well as the tax money that they pay from their jobs. We recognize that with multiple numbers, people just glaze over. So one number is enough. Tennessee gets $745 million of tax money. That's enough. And a lot of it is spent for bombs in Tennessee. You don't want to bombard people with multiple numbers trying to convince them of something. One big number, we agreed, is enough. We recognize that even though these are students in a progressive setting, that they're mostly progressive thinking students, that they still, most of them are still 18, 19, 20 years old. And as a family member in our extended family said, I only think of things in Kendra world. So psychologically, they developmentally are just coming out of being very self-centered. So, but therefore we were attempting to do what we were doing and being very respectful, and waking them up though as to what they can take ownership of. So hopefully mobilizing them to look at how the university is spending its money of investments, and as well as to look at what their personal tax dollars are. And then from that, what certainly the actions then would be communicating with the administration, as well as communicating with your politicians. Okay, thank you.
So this middle group here.
Our audience was the League of Women Voters. And I didn't know anything about the League of Women Voters, but one of our members did. And she said that they research politicians to give everybody information on these politicians. So if they do research, we thought what the best thing we could do is give them information. So we thought we would start with, what did you eat today? And do you know that you could be consuming nuclear waste every day and not know it? Give them that information. Also, like this group that talked about Dorian, we thought that we would talk about, to give them the information on 3 Mile Island, the meltdown in Japan, Flint, lead in the water, and how all these things have impacted. Definitely use visuals with these people, lots of research, and also to let them know that it's not just the bomb, but the transportation of all this stuff. After the testing, what do we do with it? The storing of all this. So for this audience, we really felt research was the best thing to give them. Did I miss anything?
Very good. So our topic was the humanitarian cost of nuclear weapons, and our audience is a Rotary Club, which we discussed. A Rotary Club is kind of a humanitarian group of goodwill, but also maybe a lot of people of privilege who are accustomed to systems working for them. And then we approached it, just said, what would be the soundbite? We wouldn't do our whole, we just said, what's the soundbite? And we present it like if there was an email going out that said, this group's going to talk. This is what the soundbite would be that we would express. Oh, and I should note that Rotary is known for their work toward the eradication of polio, which they've done a very good job with, and they've especially focused on India and Pakistan, which I think they've had success at. I think it's eradicated in those 2 places. So they have some, in the region that we're talking about, they have some background. To extend the good work in which the Rotary has taken the lead through progress like polio eradication, the U.S. must join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The cost to taxpayers of continued nuclear testing and buildup creates health hazards that undermine our humanitarian progress and take much needed funding from schools, healthcare, and infrastructure.
I want to add an addendum to that about the Rotary Club, which was interesting. Rotary Club International, and this is not true for the Rotary Club chapter in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, but the Rotary Club International has a very strong position in favor of nuclear disarmament. So you may not know that, but if you talk to Rotarians, you might bring it up with them as an entry point into the conversation. So let's go with this group here.
Sarah, you got it.
So our subject was, are nuclear weapons legal? And our audience was a Peace and Justice Center. We made the assumption that that Peace and Justice Center is here in the United States. The sources that we had were a UN treaty from 2017, a World Court opinion finding in 1996, and a nuclear proliferation treaty in 1969. And the statement that we came up with says, attention Peace and Justice Center. With regard to the legality of nuclear weapons, the United Nations negotiated a legally binding treaty on the proliferation of nuclear weapons in 2017. It provides irrefutable evidence of the environmental, ethical, health, safety, economic, and humanitarian effects of nuclear weapons creation, testing, use, and existence. The United States committed to disarm in 1969 and did not fulfill that commitment. Based on these documents, international laws are in place that are not being abided by nor enforced.
Thanks. We were with this group back here on the left, talking to a progressive student alliance, so same as over here, but about the environmental cost of nuclear weapons. We were Kevin, Cindy, Phil, Sue, and myself. So the first talking point that we wanted to put across was firstly that this is their future, young people. This is the world and environment that we'll have to live with. And then two, to apologize as perhaps an older generation, but then also just as a society that participates in nuclear weapons for getting to this point. So to own the problem. And then only after doing that, hit them with some knowledge. We had some great resources. So we kind of summed up the environmental effects. When they're used, if we were to use all the weapons in our nuclear arsenal, it would lead to a nuclear winter that would just be catastrophic for the environment. Life-sustaining plants, air, water, and 10 years to start to clean this up. But then even before their use, another one of our articles talked about, at all stages, they're detrimental to our environment. The mining, the manufacture of weapons, of course their use, and even their decommissioning all hurts soil and water. And then our last article was about testing. And even just when we were testing these things, we were trying to figure out what they were. 500,000 people lost their lives between, I think it was 50 and 1970, something like this. And not just in, I think it was New Mexico where they were tested, but apparently from the bombs to the water to cows to milk, thousands of miles away, people lost their lives. And then the last talking point was again that the people who primarily are affected by this are poor, often racial minorities that don't have the political representation around here. And then, so after hitting them with some knowledge, we decided to end with a call to action because we noted that young people, by and large, or maybe not by and large, but need that extra push to be spurred into action. So to call senators and to write and to demonstrate, because we did have an active group, so.
I want to add a sidebar to what Vincent said, because they made reference to the fact that nuclear testing and the fallout from nuclear testing was actually almost capricious in the damage that it did. So 10 or 15 years ago, on the front page of USA Today, there was a map from the National Institutes of Health that showed, they documented where fallout from every one of the US atmospheric tests that took place in Nevada had landed in the United States. And every county in the United States was assigned a certain shade of green depending on how much fallout you've gotten. So way over here in Nevada is where the test happened, and there's a county, a darker green county in upstate New York. And there's a darker green county in Idaho. And that is where it rained. A plume of radioactive air is moving across the country, and where it happened to rain, it literally precipitated out fallout from a nuclear test onto that county. Those people, of course, completely unaware, and even after the NIH finished their study and made this map, it took 3 years before Paul Sloka, a reporter in South Dakota, who had earlier worked for the Oak Ridge newspaper and decided to go and work for AP and become a real reporter. But he knew about this because of his Oak Ridge connection, and he forced the information out of the NIH, and it's on the front page of USA Today, 3 days running. It was the main story back in the day. But the impacts of nuclear weapons are just not automatic a link between cause and effect and figuring out what happened here. So circle back in the corner. Who do you have?
Okay, we had for an audience an AARP monthly luncheon. I'd like talking to ourselves. Here? And the subject was, of course, the new nuclear arms race. Now, we weren't sure sure that our audience was the right audience for that subject. We got a lot out of the history of Eisenhower's presidency. And we knew that our audience all knew him, remembered him, and he was a fairly popular fellow before and after his presidency. And we looked into the fact that he was a general, first and foremost, somebody who commanded an army, and whose assignment was to kill as a general. And so he was somebody that had a pretty good idea about killing. I don't think that nuclear weapons were as brilliant an issue at that moment. I really can't remember, but I don't remember him being involved with that. We singled out some of his special preparation, and we figured that he was the first elected president that had never been in politics, had never sought public office or held public office prior to his presidency, and how unusual that is. With the exception of Washington and our current president, he had no political track record. But he was very popular with the entire population, as I remember. I don't know if you feel the same way. I never really heard a bad word about Ike. And as a general, he recognized the huge cost of weapons. Not only the human cost of using the weapons, but the price that they cost. And I think that was a fairly original position at the time, in the 1960s. I don't know if people knew what they were spending on those weapons. And I don't know if it's important enough subject today, just the sheer dollar cost. And we compared the president's knowledge of warfare between Washington, Eisenhower, and this guy that we have, and we tried to imagine the amount of experience or capacity that they had. And it makes us to be in an extremely more dangerous environment today, when the president still has, the codes, as they say. And he has a tremendous responsibility, and his competence is in question. And we think our audience would have a hard time disagreeing with that, an ARP audience today. So we have in West Virginia, I don't know, not many West Virginians in here, but we have a governor's race coming up. And we have a very interesting guy who we consider a true candidate. And one of his angles is, when he talks to people, he knows he can't convince everybody of everything, but he likes to disagree and then come with something that they can agree on. And that's a great strategy. It's working for him. For example, if he was to talk about the Green New Deal, a lot of AARP members aren't really that keen on the idea. It seems pretty revolutionary. But on the other hand, to raise the teacher salaries, which is a big thing in West Virginia these days. So that would make an uncomfortable discussion much easier to get through. And as far as abolishing nuclear weapons, I don't know what the polls would tell us today, but there might be people who don't want to abolish them, feeling that that is a security that we have. On the other hand, Social Security, as we receive, as elderly people receive, as an important income, that's something that they can agree on. a different type of security. Or finally, we thought we'd discuss with our white audience, like an audience like this, white supremacy as an issue. And a lot of white people will have a hard time admitting this. But they would agree on parental leave. These are just arbitrarily chosen things about difficult subjects and very simple answers. We looked at another quote from Ike regarding the alert and knowledgeable citizenry. We really feel that Ike was a little bit ahead of his time. This speech could go down today and go down very well. We asked them to compare 1960 to 2019 and imagine the standing of our alert and knowledgeable citizenry, whether we have one, how it compares to what Ike had, and how important it is to become more knowledgeable about nuclear arms in particular. For our wrap-up of our lunch, we decided to ask them to plant their flag on the idea of no first strike. We think that an audience of mature adults could get together and agree on that point. And that's what we came up with.
Thank you. I will mention, I know because of a ceremony we do every year in Hiroshima Day, that Eisenhower, shortly after the bomb was dropped, described a meeting that he was in with the Secretary of War at the time, in which he strongly objected to the idea of dropping a bomb on a civilian, on any population. And he said he was made to feel very uncomfortable in the meeting, and he wasn't included in further discussions.
I also said in his departure speech to the country, beware of the military-industrial complex.
That was one of their sources that they were referring to. So we have a last group to go. Thanks.
Yeah, so we had kind of the same information about Eisenhower, but our group was the Veterans for Peace. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with the group's Veterans for Peace, but they're former veterans who have since changed their view based on maybe their experience of actual war or just military experience. So we felt like it was a very open crowd for our message. Our message was the subject of the new nuclear arms race. And like I said, we had the statement from Eisenhower and some other backup information. And the way we looked at it is like, you got to know your audience. So we thought we'd make the connection between, here we have Eisenhower, and this is one of the things that was on the statement that we wanted to share with you, is Eisenhower said, you know, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies the final sense of theft from those who hunger and are not fed, and for those who are cold and not clothed. And that's, you know, to start that out and to say, here was somebody who was in the military, who led, you know, the Great War, War II, and then became a president, and then after that to come out and make these kinds of statements to say, you know, we're taking away from everybody else. And so trying to draw in our connection and their connection with the military and having served and seen the horrors of war, that then we would update them on the budgeting and what the current expenditures were going to be, and then also to propose, like we said before, the choices. Okay, we have a choice. We can either spend this many billions on upgrade, or maybe we could spend some billions or just millions helping veterans and their needs, their medical needs, for PTSD or other mental health issues that they have happened to them because of their experiences. We've heard that. And so again, we're trying to make that connection with them to say, this is an important issue for you to go out. And so that was the thing, is to then take these issues and then say, and to ask them for their moral leverage in their community, because other veterans are probably more likely to listen to another veteran about the issues and what is strong for them. So again, just to ask the Veterans for Peace to use their moral capital to help bring awareness about these new proposals for budgets, and also different and smarter policies, including some of the no first strike policies. So just being another advocate to go to their senators, to go to their congressmen, or to speak out against these issues. That's what we felt like was important. Thank you.
Virtually every one of these audiences that we imagined here are audiences that I have had to talk got to talk to in the last several years, and I kind of wish I'd done this exercise before. Now, because looking out across the room, I don't think we have quite enough chaos in the seating arrangements now, so I'm going to ask you to do this closing thing. I want you to adjust the chair so that you're paired up with one other person, the two of you facing each other, maybe with your knees almost touching. If you could do that. It can be someone you, no, it doesn't matter. And if your circle has an odd number, one of you will go and find a space somewhere else. Bob over here doesn't have it. Oh, she's clear.
CCA? No. Yeah, the last minute thing.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Now, did I say start convincing with the person across the room? All right, so I want you to take a moment first to center yourself. And like we did earlier this morning, be mindful of your breathing. Now, this is a safe exercise, so don't be anxious. And when you're comfortable, look into the eyes of the person across from you. Maybe this is a person you know well. Maybe you just met them today. This is a person who is concerned about the threat of nuclear war, who cherishes the earth and its capacity to sustain life. Something the two of you have in common. Hold their gaze. Earlier today, they brought to mind someone that they care for, someone who is precious to them, just like you did. They imagined a future in which that person was free to thrive, to develop their talents, to fall in love, to make a living, to celebrate birthdays and friendships, to enjoy picnics or ball games or concerts. Over the course of the last 2 hours, they have also had to worry about that person, as you have. Something else you have in common. The weapons that threaten you threaten all of us. Now I'm going to ask everyone in the room to do the same thing with the person across from them. I want you to think of one thing that you have learned today that you can use to protect your precious friend. One thing you have learned today. And one thing that you can do with that information or that feeling to work for a world free of nuclear weapons. This is your gift to the future. Take a moment to think. One thing you have learned and one thing you can do with it. When you have it in your mind and are prepared to say it to the person across from you, today I learned and I want to use it too. When you're ready, just nod to them. And when you're ready, you can start. One can share first and then the other. Today I learned and I want to use it too.
When something comes up,
Right, correct. I've got enough going on. Right, it's not just like pertinent in their minds. Yeah. Yeah. Get lost in the shuffle of it. Right. Yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah. I'd say, yeah, also like hearing the title of it, like, oh, do you want yeah, it just sounded like so big and like, whoa, I have no idea what this is. This is like a chicken and a worm. So I feel like just like, yeah, recognizing like, wow, this is how much is sitting in reserve and we're still building. Like, why? Why would we ever
All right.
20,000?
One more thing.
Yeah.
Now I want you to look in your partner's eyes again and say after me, thank you for sharing this with me. I hear you. And I will help you create a world free of nuclear weapons. And now look up here at me. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being brave enough to imagine a world free of nuclear weapons. Thank you for being honest with yourself and your fears. The world that we want to create together for future generations is not impossible. We can build the power together to create that world. And that is our calling. Thank you very much.